She lay on the cold floor of the cage, exhausted and hopeless. The creak of the lock, the tight collar, they were leading her down the corridor toward that very door, the one beyond which dogs never returned. Her heart pounded wildly, each step bringing her closer to the end. But at the last moment, Leah, summoning all her remaining strength, broke free and bolted. What happened next? The wind whistled through the dark corridors of the old shelter, howling between the cracks in the crumbling walls like a mournful lament. The light bulbs flickered dimly, casting a faint glow on the dirty gray floor, scratched by the claws of dozens of dogs who had long since left this place for good. But one cage remained perpetually locked. Leah, a German shepherd, lay curled up in the far corner of her cage, as if trying to shrink, to vanish, to dissolve into the shadows. Her once thick and strong coat was matted, with patches of bare skin visible where she had rubbed against the cold metal bars for hours on end. Leah barely moved, as though even breathing caused her pain. Her golden, deep eyes were filled with emptiness. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching her cage. Leah flinched and tensed. She heard them every day, rhythmic, indifferent steps of the man who brought food. Today, as always, he approached silently, set down a bowl of something stale, and walked away. Leah didn't stir. Hunger had been her companion for so long that she no longer felt the urge to eat. Once, she had lived in a warm home where every step she took was accompanied by the joyful laughter of children, and warm hands scratched behind her ears. She had been a protector, a friend, a member of the family. But it had all ended so suddenly that Leah hadn't had time to understand how her world had fallen apart. The family left, abandoning her on the concrete steps in front of the shelter. The door slammed shut behind them, and she stood there, watching their car disappear into the distance. Months had passed since then, but she was still waiting. Every night, lying on the cold floor, she listened to every sound outside the window. She dreamed of her owner opening the cage, calling her home, of feeling the warmth of a human hand again. But each dawn brought only another wave of cold and loneliness. Her body had not only grown frail, but was also marked by scars from the past. When Leah had tried to escape her cage, she had torn the pads of her paws on the rusty bars. Blood had dripped onto the concrete, leaving crimson stains, but no one paid attention. No one came to comfort or help her. She had learned to endure pain, to suffer silently, without drawing attention to herself. Sometimes, other dogs howled in the night, their cries tearing through the darkness. But Leah remained silent. Her voice, like her hope, had faded. Her world had turned as gray as the concrete walls surrounding her, and every day was just a repeat of the one before. She watched other dogs being taken out of their cages. Some returned, emaciated, with marks of needles or wounds, while others never came back. She sensed their fear, saw the panic in their eyes as they were led away. Now it was, that night, lying in the corner of her cage, she stared at the moon, faintly visible through the dirty window. Snow outside fell gently, blanketing the earth in a soft cover. But inside the shelter, it was colder than the winter frost. Leah pulled her paws closer to. Her heart beat slowly, almost lazily, as if life itself was tired of clinging to her body. She thought that if she could cry, her face would be wet with tears. But she couldn't. Her tears had dried up long ago, leaving behind only a hollow ache. And then she heard whispers, the voices of the workers, quiet but searing. "They'll take her tomorrow. There's no point keeping her anymore." These words, spoken as a mundane fact, echoed in her mind. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would be gone. Leah didn't understand the words, but she felt them. She knew her cage would open soon, and it would be the end. Her gaze, hollow and silent, swept across the room. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled, and she fell onto her side again. The silence of the night enveloped the shelter. Leah lay motionless, listening to the sound of her slow breathing, and in that breath was a faint glimmer of hope, weak and barely perceptible, but still alive. A gray morning. Snow had fallen all night, covering the ground with a thick white blanket by dawn. But inside the shelter, despite the winter chill, the air was heavy and stale. Workers clad in warm jackets exchanged indifferent words. One of them held a long rope with a metal leash. His steps, dull and steady, echoed down the corridor, drawing closer to Leah's cage. She didn't move, lying on the cold floor. But the moment the lock on her cage clicked, her heart began to pound faster, the heavy thudding echoing in her chest. She raised her head, her amber eyes wide open. Leah had known this day would come. She had felt it the night before. But now, as the moment became reality, fear crashed over her like an avalanche. "Come on," the worker said quietly, almost indifferently, as he unfastened the latch. Leah tensed her entire body. She saw the coldness in his gaze, heard the harshness in his voice. Not a trace of compassion. No sign that anyone cared about her fate. The man yanked roughly on the leash, but she didn't budge. "Don't make me drag you," he muttered irritably, tugging harder on the rope. Leah, still trembling, slowly rose to her feet. Her legs quivered under the weight of her weakened body. Her matted fur hung limply, and her ears were pinned back against her head. She knew resistance was pointless. He pulled her along the cold floor, her paws sliding, her claws scraping the concrete, leaving faint scratches in her wake. The corridor stretched out before her like an endless tunnel. Each cage was filled with eyes, other dogs watching her in silence. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with fear, and a few with indifference. And then, there was the door. Heavy, metal, its peeling paint revealing years of neglect. Beyond it lay the room where she had seen other dogs led, the ones who never came back. When the door creaked open, a cold draft from the poorly heated room hit her face. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of medicine and something sickly sweet. Leah took a few hesitant steps, but then froze. Fear overwhelmed her, and her survival instincts flared like lightning. Her body trembled, her tail tucked under her belly, and her ears shot up. Her instinct screamed, "Run!" "What are you waiting for? Move!" the worker barked, yanking the leash. But at that moment, Leah, summoning every ounce of strength she had left, jerked her head sharply to the side, slipping her neck out of the collar. The man froze for a moment, stunned by her sudden move. Leah bolted. Her claws skidded across the floor, but she didn't stop. Adrenaline propelled her forward, her legs moving as though fate itself was pulling her out of this place. She sprinted through the corridors, past the cages, past the startled workers. Behind her, shouts erupted. "Stop her! She's getting away!" But Leah no longer heard them. She saw only the light at the end of the corridor, a light that meant freedom. The wide doors were ajar, and beyond them the dazzling white snow awaited. She lunged forward, feeling the icy burn of the snow on her paws but ignoring the pain. When she finally burst outside, the sunlight momentarily blinded her. The snow sparkled like millions of tiny mirrors. But she didn't stop. The wind lashed against her face, the frost biting at her skin, but she ran with everything she had. Her breathing was ragged, her chest tightened by the cold. Her paws sank deeper into the soft snow with every step, but she didn't look back. Leah knew that if she stopped, they would catch her. The forest lay ahead, Bare trees, black and lifeless, stretched toward the sky like ghostly fingers. But to Leah, it was a sanctuary. She veered off the road, plunging into the thicket, weaving between the trunks, leaving behind a trail of twisted, confusing tracks. At last, her strength gave out. She collapsed by a fallen tree, her breath coming in heavy gasps, her body trembling from the cold. Her paws throbbed with pain, and her muscles ached. Leah pressed herself against the ground, trying to disappear, to hide from the world. Her heart still raced, pounding like a drum. She was free. But at what cost? Could she survive? She didn't know. All she knew was that today she had fought for her life, and for the first time in a long while she tasted hope, bittersweet and mingled with the icy sting of winter air. The snow had stopped, but the frost grew harsher. The forest was silent, no whisper of the wind, no creak of branches, only the icy, indifferent stillness of nature. Leah lay beneath a fallen tree, her fur coated with frost. Each breath escaped her mouth as a small cloud of steam, vanishing instantly into the frigid air. The frost gnawed at her paws like sharp needles, and every movement sent painful spasms through her body. Her body refused to obey. The strength she'd mustered for her escape had drained away. Hunger gnawed at her insides, the rumbling in her stomach louder than her labored breathing. Her muscles ached with exhaustion, and her lungs burned from the cold. Around her was nothing but endless white drifts, marked only by the uneven, deep tracks she had left behind. Time seemed to stop. Leah tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her, as if shackled by invisible chains. She pressed herself against the ground, staring into the emptiness ahead. In the deafening silence, painful memories clawed their way to the surface. Her owner's face, children's laughter, the smell of food, the warmth of the fireplace. She remembered curling up at her owner's feet, his hand gently scratching behind her ear as he whispered kind words. These memories hit her like a blow, forcing a quiet, mournful whimper from her chest. But that was all in the past. Reality crashed down on her again, cold and unyielding. She was alone. No one would come for her. No one would call her home. All she could do was wait, as the frost slowly claimed her. Then, in the distance, came the faint crack of branches. Leah froze, her ears pricking up, her heart beating faster. Something or someone was moving toward her. Her instincts screamed danger. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out once more, and she collapsed. The cracking grew louder. The sound drew nearer. Leah sniffed the air, straining to pick up a scent, but hunger and exhaustion dulled her senses. She couldn't tell if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. And then, from between the trees, a figure emerged. A man, wrapped in a thick coat, carrying a bright flashlight. Leah's amber eyes locked onto him, her body frozen in place. She didn't move, didn't even breathe, watching as he scanned the forest around him. "Hey," he murmured when he spotted her. Leah pressed herself closer to the ground, her ears flattened, her eyes narrowing. She didn't know what to expect. The man's eyes were tired, but there was no malice in them. Slowly, he knelt, setting the flashlight down in the snow to avoid blinding her. "Don't be scared, okay? I won't hurt you," he said softly, his tone calm and steady. Leah remained tense, her gaze fixed on him with unwavering suspicion. The man extended a hand toward her, but she flinched and struggled to her feet. Her body trembled, but her eyes burned with a readiness to fight. He didn't move closer. Instead, he spoke again, his voice as gentle as the whisper of the wind. You're freezing, aren't you? And hungry. I just want to help. Leah caught the faint scent of food. Slowly, the man pulled a small piece of bread from his pocket and placed it on the snow. Her eyes darted between him and the bread. Her instincts screamed, "Don't go near it! It's a trap!" But hunger clawed at her, overpowering her caution. She took a tentative step forward, then another, inching closer. Her heart pounded furiously in her chest. In a flash, she snatched the bread and leapt back, expecting an attack. But the man remained still, making no sudden movements. "It's okay," he said softly. His voice carried a sincerity that stirred something deep within her. Leah hesitated. Her gaze shifted from the man to the dark forest behind him. She could still run, but her strength was almost gone. Her legs wobbled, then buckled, and she collapsed into the snow, panting heavily. The man slowly approached her, removing his coat as he did. Gently, he draped it over her frail body. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Leah felt warmth. She wanted to resist, to fight back, but her body wouldn't cooperate. In that moment, lying in the snow, she realized her fate now rested in his hands. This encounter changed everything, but in Leah's eyes, the pain, fear, and mistrust still lingered. Salvation was within reach, but could she truly believe that a human could offer kindness? Leah awoke to a soft warmth enveloping her frail body. For the first time in days, she didn't feel the bite of the icy wind or the searing cold. Her eyes slowly opened, and the first thing she saw was the golden glow of a lamp filling the room with gentle light. She lay on a thick blanket near a crackling fireplace, its soft warmth blending with the faint, comforting scent of burning wood. Leah tried to stand, but weakness overtook her, and she sank back onto the blanket. Her legs trembled, her body still recovering from the days spent in the cold. Turning her head, her gaze met the eyes of the man who had found her. He was sitting nearby in a chair, holding a steaming mug in his hands. His face looked tired, but when he noticed Leah was awake, a warm smile softened his features. "Good morning, beautiful," he said gently. Leah flinched at the sound of his voice, fear flashing in her eyes. Her body instinctively tensed, ready to defend herself. But the man didn't move. His hands remained still, and his gaze was filled with nothing but kindness. "It's okay. You're safe," he said, his voice steady and calm as his eyes held hers. Her breathing slowed slightly, but the fear lingered. She saw a human in front of her, yet the memories of betrayal and loneliness kept her from letting her guard down. Every time she'd seen an outstretched hand in the past, it had brought only pain and emptiness. The man didn't rush her. He stood slowly, walked to a table, and placed a bowl of warm broth near her. The aroma made Leah's nose twitch. Hunger gripped her again, and she cautiously inched toward the bowl. She lapped at the broth, eating a few small pieces of meat, but soon stopped and lifted her head, her wary eyes fixed on the man as if she were waiting for him to act, to show his true intentions. But he simply watched her in silence, making no sudden movements. The days passed slowly. The man, whose name was Thomas, didn't force his presence on her. He spoke to her in a quiet, soothing voice, giving her time to adjust. Every time he moved closer, Leah tensed, but he respected her space, never pushing her boundaries. Little by little, Leah began to trust him. At first, she allowed him to sit closer. Then, after a few days, she let him gently touch her head. That moment was like the cracking of ice, a fragile barrier of mistrust beginning to break. One night, Leah did something that surprised even herself. She approached Thomas as he sat by the fire and carefully rested her head on his knees. Her body trembled and fear still flickered in her eyes, but in that moment, she accepted his care. Thomas gently ran his hand over her head, his fingers gliding through her fur with a tenderness she hadn't felt in so long. "You're a brave girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Time began to heal her wounds, though the scars remained. Leah learned to walk through the house without fear of sudden noises, and she started to respond to Thomas's voice with a slight wag of her tail. Yet whenever she heard a noise outside the window, her body would stiffen, her gaze clouded with unease. Thomas noticed this. "I know it's been hard for you," he said, sitting beside her, "but things are different now. You're safe." When spring came, Thomas took Leah to the park. It was her first time experiencing the world again, the scent of fresh grass, the songs of birds, the feeling of soft earth under her paws instead of cold concrete. She moved hesitantly, cautiously sniffing her surroundings as if rediscovering a world she thought she had lost. But shadows of her past still lingered. Each time Thomas stepped a few paces away, Leah froze in fear, as though terrified he wouldn't return. And each time Thomas came back, reassuring her she would never be abandoned again. Months passed. Leah began to transform, both inside and out. Her coat became glossy, her body regained its strength, and her eyes, though still touched by the pain of her past, now held more hope than fear. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Thomas stroked her ears and looked at her with a gentle smile. "You know," he said softly, "you saved me just as much as I saved you." Leah tilted her head, her deep amber eyes locking onto his, filled with gratitude and understanding. She couldn't speak, but in that moment, no words were needed. Between them, there was a bond stronger than anything words could ever convey.